Hi, everyone. Good evening and good morning to our participants, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Jessica Gordon, and I'm a Senior Climate Policy Fellow at the California China Climate Institute, and I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. Before we get started, I'd just like to share a few quick housekeeping notes. First of all, we are recording this event, and it will be available later on our website. This event is also being simultaneously translated into Mandarin Chinese. So you can use the globe icon at the base of your screen and then either select English or the Chinese channel as your preferred language. If you'd like to ask a question of one of our panelists during the audience Q&A portion of our event, please type your question into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can live. So forests are critical to meet our climate goals, to protect biodiversity, and also to support livelihoods. There's no way for us to meet our Paris Agreement goals without significantly reducing deforestation. The U.S. and China have collaborated on addressing deforestation in the past, and last year at the International Climate Conference, both countries reaffirmed their commitment to work on eliminating illegal deforestation through a joint declaration on enhancing climate action in the 2020s, and also with the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on forest and land use. So today we're very fortunate to have an incredible group of experts with us to share about what the US and China are doing domestically and what they could do collaboratively to combat illegal deforestation. So I'll now introduce all of our speakers in the order of their presentations. First, we have Kirsten Canby, who is Senior Director of Forest Trends, Forest Trade and Finance Program, who will provide some background on the issue and tools to combat illegal deforestation and associated trade. Next, we'll hear from Dimitri DeBoer, Head of Client Earth's China office, on opportunities for China to reduce illegal deforestation. Then we'll hear from Stephanie Kappa, Director of Policy and Government Affairs at WWF, who will focus on US policy. And finally, we'll hear from Jason Gray, Project Director of the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force at the University of California, Los Angeles, on jurisdictional approaches. So welcome to all of you, and thanks so much for being here today. And now, Kirsten, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You already introduced me. I'm Kirsten Canby. I work for Forest Trends. We're an international organization. We're based in Washington, D.C., but we've been working in China and Mekong countries and global trade issues for more than 20 years. So I'm going to share my screen now to my presentation. So hopefully all of you can see my presentation, and raise your hand if it's not showing for some reason. Now I need to figure out how to go to the next slide. Okay, so we already had an introduction to last November's Glasgow Declaration, where Article 10 shows that the two nations, China and the US, pledged to engage collaboratively in support of eliminating global illegal deforestation. So I'm just going to quickly go to the next slide. I wanted to just introduce this topic, this term, illegal deforestation. Why is it not zero deforestation or unsustainable deforestation or unsustainability at all? A review of the concept of illegality. Typically, when we've been talking about illegal timber and associated trade, and now the trade of commodities that have been, we're calling illegal deforestation, the illegality is defined as a violation of the national laws and regulations in the producer country where the commodity was produced. This is slightly easier in practice than to define what is sustainability. If you ask an ecologist, they'll have one definition of sustainability. If you ask an economist, they'll have another definition. But it is more difficult to identify than zero deforestation, where satellite imagery and just on-the-ground field checks can tell you whether the area has been deforested or not. But the concept of illegality has been picked up by some because it supports a producer country's own efforts at implementing their own laws and regulations. So it really supports their own efforts at governance. It facilitates bilateral dialogue because no country will ever complain if a buyer, a buying country, an importing nation says we would like to support you in implementing your own laws and regulations. And this is very for those countries which believe strongly in principles of national sovereignty. I'm going to go through to talk about this link between climate emissions and illegal deforestation. Forest Trends last year and then in 2014 released 2 reports on analysis on the extent and nature of illegality in forest conversion for agriculture and for timber plantation. So we did the report in 2014, and then we provided updates last year. So just to summarize the numbers, this is just tropical deforestation between 2013 and 2019 reached about 11 million hectares per year, which was a 52% increase over the study period before of 2000 to 2012. Then 60% of all tropical deforestation is driven by commercial agriculture. So here, of that 11 million hectares per year, 6.6 are due to commercial agriculture, which was a 28% increase over the 2000 to 2012 period. And then this is where our report had some new numbers, where 69% of all of that tropical deforestation driven by commercial agriculture was actually illegal. So deforestation for agriculture that did not comply with the producer country's own laws was 4.5 million hectares per year, and that was increased over the study period from the previous study period. Then we looked at, well, how much is this caused by demand from consumers around the world, from international trade? And we found that exports are an important driver of this loss. Domestic consumption in the producer countries is very important in certain countries, but we can't ignore the fact that the demand in consumer countries is driving this. So our report looked at the 10 major agricultural commodities, and we found that 55 billion exports are contaminated with the high risk of deforestation that's illegal. And that's equivalent to 1.2 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. I'm not going to go into this report, but this report will show you where the differences between Asia, Africa, and Latin America. This slide focuses more on Latin America. Here in the light green is 19.8 million hectares, which are caused by driven by domestic consumption, and 6.2 by international consumption. And on top here in Latin America, we estimated that 88% of the deforestation was illegal. So then we look at where are the major markets for these exports. And this is a WWF report from a few years back where it shows the share of tropical deforestation associated with international trade. And China, the EU, India, the US, and Japan are all high in their consumption, what we call it their carbon footprint. And you do have to note that especially China and India, a lot of those imports are actually then reprocessed or processed and then re-exported to other markets. So what are some of the tools that some of the speakers today are going to talk about? We have regulatory approaches, so import restrictions against the trade in timber and commodities that are produced on illegally cleared land. There are public procurement processes where government's procurement mandates that suppliers can only provide timber and agricultural commodities that can be verified as having been produced legally. There are corporate measures, typically voluntary corporate measures. Corporations have made lots of commitments to look at their supply chain to ensure legality or sustainability in their supply chain. And there has been talk about fiscal incentives, trade incentives for verified legal products. Example will be a reduction in trade tariffs or subsidies for purchases of verified legal. I don't think we've seen any yet, but it's discussed. And a couple of examples of the import regulations at the national level. The Europeans have had the EU timber regulation since 2013. It's timber only. So in the blue here are regulations that are actually already in place and being implemented. So Europe has the timber regulation, and it only has a draft deforestation due diligence regulation. The UK has a timber regulation, it's under implementation, and it has an environment law which will address illegal commodities. It's been passed, but they're now drafting implementing regulations. The US has the US Lacey Act since 2008. It only covers timber. And there is now a draft Forest Act, which I believe Stephanie will talk to us about, and that's for illegal imports of illegal agricultural commodities. Japan and Australia and South Korea all have regulations in place, but they're for timber only. Vietnam as well. And China has Article 67 in its forest law, but it is not yet being implemented. And I just wanted to end with a short note from a US Congressman, US Representative Earl Blumenauer, where he says, I think most US consumers would strongly agree that it's immoral, outdated, and preposterous that products sold on supermarket shelves can be traced back to illegally deforested land. And if any one of you need to contact me, here is my information.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. And now, Dimitri, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jessica, and also thank you, Kirsten, for that very helpful opening. My name is Dimitri de Boer of Client Earth in China, and I will now also share my slides if I can manage to do so. Great. I've somehow managed to, here we go. So before I start, I just want to emphasize that I'm also the team leader of the EU China Environment Project, which is a bilateral EU-funded project with China. And in this project, the topic of deforestation has also been addressed over the past couple of years and still an ongoing topic. So within China, there are increasingly effective efforts to stop deforestation and to afforestation efforts have also been very successful. So China is probably the most successful country in the world actually in afforestation, and has included in its NDC, in its commitments to the Paris Agreement, also ambitious targets for afforestation, increasing forest cover. There are still some instances of land use change where, let's say, tropical high quality forests are being converted into, let's say, monoculture forests, so much lower quality forests. But that also is being addressed quite actively now. So we're seeing a lot of public interest litigation, which is in China mainly prosecutors litigating against government agencies where they're not effectively addressing environmental violations within the country. And at a higher level, you have what's called central environmental inspections, where provinces and governors and leaders are being confronted with data on their environmental performance, and satellite imagery will often be used in those cases as well. So to summarize, within China, I think it's safe to say that deforestation is being addressed quite effectively, and it's not really of my greatest concern, let's say. However, as Kirsten just showed us, the supply chains of China are still, contributing to global deforestation. And China is the largest importer of a number of agricultural commodities which are linked to deforestation, especially in tropical regions. So we've seen a lot of international engagement in the last couple of years, and the Chinese government is increasingly aware of this issue, especially the Ministry of Environment. And also we're seeing sort of a greater, let's say, among the leadership of China, we're seeing a gradual shift in attitude. So especially the Glasgow Declaration was helpful. Many people may not have noticed, but about a month before that, the EU and China had a joint communique, which also included a joint ambition to cooperate on this topic. So I'll just show you the text of that communique. It says both sides agree to engage collaboratively in support of eradicating global deforestation. And so what I like about this text is that it specifically refers to making supply chains more sustainable and combating illegal logging and associated trade. So to my knowledge, this is probably the most useful language that we've seen in a communication from China on this topic. And it also gave us, Client Earth, an opening to support that effort by starting a study with the Chinese government on this topic of legal mechanisms to green supply chains. I think this is the first time that the Chinese government is engaging in such a sort of a clear study to look into the legal options. And Kirsten just told us, in very basic terms, what those options are, which I thought was really helpful. Kirsten, thank you for that. And also showing us what other countries have already done. So that's exactly the sort of thing we're doing right now in this study, is to summarize the experience from around the world and to look at the options. Europe is adopting a zero deforestation approach, where they rather than looking at whether the deforestation was legal or illegal in the producer country, they're looking at zero deforestation. I think given China's, let's say, attitude towards many of these things, it's more likely that China might lean towards a legality approach, looking at whether the production of timber, but also perhaps other commodities in supplier countries, was legal or not. But there's still quite a ways to go. The forest laws, Article 65, there's been a bit of unclarity of whether that will actually cover imports. And as far as I currently understand, it may not. Chinese legislators find it challenging that a Chinese law would apply to activities in another country. So that's something that it's not clear how that will be resolved at this point. Also, the implementing regulations of that article, which mainly entail importers to have a registry of where their timber comes from, has not yet been issued, and it's been quite a while already. So there's some delays, which I understand may be linked to the economic concerns that China has at this point. So that's the status in China on this topic. Trying to see if I missed anything really important. No, that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri. Yeah, that was a fantastic overview. And now I'd like to turn it over to Stephanie Kappa.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yes, I think so. Great. Well, thank you for the invitation to be here, and thank you for all those joining us here today. I'm Stephanie Kappa, the Director of Policy and Government Affairs at World Wildlife Fund here in the United States. I lead our U.S. focused policy and advocacy in pursuit of our goal to conserve the most important forests around the world and other critical ecosystems as well. So to take a step back, as has been noted, after the burning of fossil fuels, the destruction of forests and other ecosystems, together with unsustainable land use, is the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions globally. And when we lose forests, we not only let loose carbon that has been stored in trees and roots and soil for eons, we lose the capacity for those forests to absorb new emissions. We also lose the ecosystems that are home to most of the world's terrestrial biodiversity, and we lose our first line of defense against the spread of infectious diseases from wildlife to humans. So we at WWF and many of our partners on this call and around the world see conserving and restoring forests as one of the most effective and beneficial nature-based solutions to addressing both the climate and the biodiversity crises. So we need to use all the tools in our toolbox to address these crises, and policy in particular to address illegal logging and deforestation is an important part of that solution. And that's where I'll come in with my remarks today. So I'll start off by saying that in 2021, WWF actually released an updated deforestation fronts report where we looked at where deforestation is occurring globally, what is causing deforestation, and what is working in terms of actual solutions. And I just put the link to that report in the chat so folks can take a look at your leisure. So this analysis looked at the tropics and subtropics in particular, which account for at least 2/3 of global forest loss from 2000 to 2018, the time period over which the report reviewed, and found that an area the size of California was lost to deforestation in just over a decade in the tropics and subtropics alone. So again, just underscoring the massive scale of this challenge globally. And though the challenge is significant, there are just a handful of drivers: agriculture, extractive industries, infrastructure, and fire, with, as Kirsten noted, the expansion of commercial agriculture as the leading driver of deforestation globally, and in particular for the production of just a handful of commodities, as was noted previously, and in particular cattle, palm, soy, paper, and wood. So WWF also looked at the responses that have been deployed to address deforestation and found that some of the best progress we've seen in lowering deforestation rates are where integrated approaches have been implemented, and particularly with the engagement of local communities. And so that's bringing together both area-based responses, including parks, protected and conserved areas, tenure rights for Indigenous peoples and local communities, paired with commodity or sector-specific approaches, such as deforestation-free commitments and policies. So this has specific implications for policy, and in particular policy in the US, where I focus, although of course WWF is a global network. So generally speaking, on the policy front, we know that we need to see government leadership backed by funding and policies and diplomatic engagement to address this challenge from a number of fronts. And I'll just quickly run through four. One, we need to see protection and restoration of forests and other natural landscapes. Two, we need to eliminate commodity-driven deforestation, forest degradation, and habitat conversion. Three, we need to halt bad actors from illegally engaging in conversion, timber extraction, and trade. And four, we need to promote sustainable livelihoods and the recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So as has been noted, we are in what we hope is a major moment for action around forests and ecosystems, coming out of last year's COP, heading into this year's COP, alongside the Glasgow Leaders commitment of 141 countries, President Biden here in the U.S. committed to provide $9 billion by 2030 to conserve global forests and other critical ecosystems in partnership with the private sector and government, civil society, and indigenous peoples. And we've seen a number of steps from the Biden administration since then to follow up on that pledge. And one in particular I'll note is an executive order that was signed on Earth Day this past year on global deforestation and addressing commodity-driven deforestation and directing the federal government to take stock of our natural heritage and take steps to protect it for the future, including through forest conservation, both domestically and internationally. So in addition to that executive action, WWF is actively engaged in and supportive of two pieces of proposed legislation before our Congress that would strengthen the role that the U.S. government can play in establishing policy and enforcement mechanisms to effectively curb global deforestation and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the first of those pieces of legislation, as Kirsten noted, is the Forest Act, and that's the Fostering Overseas Rule of Law and Environmentally Sound Trade Act. Always have a good acronym. And this is legislation that would establish a new mechanism to eliminate illegal deforestation from key imported agricultural products. It would create a risk-based framework for increasing supply chain transparency and reporting by companies importing agricultural products into the US. And so it would create quite a strong incentive for US businesses to reduce their footprint in the illegal deforestation space. The second piece of legislation that we are engaging with and we see as quite promising is the Amazon 21 Act that has also been introduced in the last year. And that would authorize a new US trust fund to finance projects in US partner countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including through new forest conservation and reforestation efforts. And so taken together, we see these two pieces of legislation as being, as applying the sort of complementary area-based and sort of demand-side sector-specific approaches that we've seen successfully address deforestation in key areas. So while these pieces of proposed legislation can help address deforestation, existing US policy, such as the 2008 Lacey Act amendments, also previously noted, are already making a significant difference and can do even more. And just to say, on the Lacey Act amendments, a bit of background there. In 2008, the United States was the first country to ban the trafficking of products that containing illegally sourced wood. And the amendments were adopted with bipartisan support in the US Congress, and they have, over the ensuing decade plus, contributed to reduced imports of illegally sourced wood products by, and this is an estimate from a few years ago, 32 to 44%. And so this policy and now law has clearly demonstrated its potential for impact. However, delays in full implementation and enforcement do continue to limit the law's effectiveness. And so if implementation here can be strengthened and partnership with countries and producers, consumers, and businesses globally can be strengthened, I think we have the potential to dramatically improve US efforts to stop the import of illegal logging and associated trade, which continues to be the third largest global transnational crime. So that's a brief sort of snapshot of the U.S. policy landscape relating to deforestation, illegal deforestation, and illegal logging, and how we see some of these pieces fitting together and opportunities for the near term for the U.S. government to play a lead role with other countries, businesses, producers, and consumers. So stay tuned for more, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was a great overview of what's happening in the US. And now I'll pass it over to Jason Gray.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm going to share here. Thanks. And the California China Climate Institute, thank you for the invitation to participate in today's discussion. It's amazing to me to be able to build on the excellent presentations of my fellow panelists. And luckily, I think you'll hear a lot of very similar remarks. So it sounds like we're quite aligned on some of the approaches that folks are taking. I'm going to discuss a little different kind of spin on some of the successful stories and some of the needs that are expressed in my fellow panelists, and focus on how supporting jurisdictional approaches to reducing deforestation would be an important action that both the US and China can take on addressing not only illegal deforestation, but also deforestation more broadly. Very aligned, I think, with the last presentation. But by way of example, I'm going to focus most of my presentation on the subnational government approach. Just that's what I'm most familiar with through the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force, where I serve as project director through the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at UCLA School of Law. The GCF Task Force is a subnational collaboration of 39 states and provinces working to protect tropical forests, reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, and promote realistic pathways to forest maintaining and rural development. We're actually the world's largest platform for states and provinces committed to this mission. But just for clarification, what do I mean by jurisdictional approach? And this, from our kind of our vision, is really a government-led comprehensive program to forest management and land use across one or more legally defined territories that's developed and implemented by a jurisdiction. These are different from traditional project scale approaches that are common in some payment for performance systems and voluntary carbon market approaches. These jurisdictional approaches really are looking at that kind of integrated approach that was just discussed. And they can, of course, incorporate many project level approaches as well. Whoops, excuse me. So why do we at the GCF Task Force focus on subnational governments? And this is really because action on the ground is essential for addressing the tropical deforestation challenge. And states and provinces, state and provincial governments are really closest to their specific contexts and to the potential drivers of deforestation and mechanisms to address it. And their efforts are really necessary to meet both national level goals, but also global ambitions. And many of the subnational members of our network are actually quite large. You can see on this map. Some of them are larger than countries. So this still continues to help, like the national level, address the challenges at scale. We also focus on subnational governments because it allows us as a network to support and advance subnational leadership and policy innovation. Sometimes subnational governments, I'm from the state of I live in the state of California, we like to innovate, are able to advance innovation that can then be picked up at the national level. And we do this through supporting governors and civil servants who are doing the hard technical, policy, and legal work to promote conservation and low emissions development. We take an integrated approach to promote partnerships, working with supply chain, private sector stakeholders such as supply chain leaders and indigenous peoples and local communities. And we work to maintain pathways and strategies for effective action that reduces deforestation and enhances livelihoods. With this as an example, I'm going to go into a few of the approaches that some of the members in the GCF Task Force have taken, and hopefully that helps provide helpful context for where additional support from the US and China may really be helpful. GCF task force jurisdictions have developed their own strategies and implementation plans that reflect best practices and also the realities in their territories. I think importantly from the sovereignty context, this really reflects the will of these governors and governments to address not only drivers of illegal deforestation, but really the underlying drivers and economic realities that result in deforestation in their territories. Most have developed multi-pronged policy strategies and innovative approaches, which they're hoping now to incorporate into their legal and policy structures to seek long-term sustainable financial tools and investment to ensure long-lasting reductions in sustainable economic development. Some potential actions within these strategies have been mentioned in other panelists today, but they include increased conservation measures, partnering directly with indigenous peoples to enhance land tenure and rights, and reducing lands available for deforestation, enforcing legal standards and rights, combating illegal land clearing, enhancing enabling conditions for the private sector within these jurisdictions through efforts such as zero deforestation commodities. I'm currently in Mexico at a conference looking at deforestation-free beef and agave. These strategies can also include demonstrating robust, often and have to include demonstrating robust monitoring, reporting, and verification of results, and strong and rigorous carbon accounting standards to demonstrate that deforestation is being reduced. That may help some of these jurisdictions access financing tools like carbon markets or payment for ecosystem services, and also importantly, through zero deforestation free supply chain investors. Developing these strategies at the scale of a subnational government or at a national level through these jurisdictional approaches also helps ensure longer term change, incorporation of local realities, and respect for their sovereignty, laws, and needs, since the jurisdiction itself is developing and implementing a program. As was mentioned, combating deforestation requires recognizing the different and current economic realities that are driving deforestation and addressing these realities at scale. And helping enable alternatives to the current economic drivers really helps ensure that there's ongoing economic growth, the resulting jobs, poverty alleviation, and tax revenues, and doing that through an integrated policy approach is really the approach that the members of this organization are trying to do. So supporting these jurisdictions through better tools for monitoring, reporting, verification, supporting capacity building and training, enhanced enforcement efforts, recognizing efforts to implement robust accounting standards. These are all useful things that the U.S. government and the Chinese government could help on. And are helping on already, I recognize that. I'll also highlight just again, kind of the clear expression that some of these jurisdictional approaches are having about the challenges, needs, and commitments that they are undertaking and looking for additional support on. This slide lists a few of those made recently in March by our members through something called the Manaus Action Plan for a New Forest Economy that's really focusing kind of on this integrated approach across their entire territories. They've committed to an at least 80% reduction by 2030, increased restoration and adaptation efforts, but recognizing the realities that this has to be done in a way that has long-term support and growth for their jurisdictions. They really issued this plan as a call to action for support. A lot of these have been mentioned, so I won't go through them all, but these are just a few of the ways that what we see can be helpful for our subnational members, but also just through a jurisdiction scale approach for the US and China to enhance the support they're currently giving, really broadening collaboration to combat deforestation generally, while also continuing to combat illegal deforestation through existing laws and new laws, supporting jurisdictions developing jurisdiction scale legal, regulatory, and incentive approaches, supporting enforcement mechanisms and efforts, as is underway now, supporting upfront finance mechanisms, again, on the capacity building and scale for subnational and national jurisdictions, and also really facilitating knowledge exchange as companies in the US and China are trading companies. That would be something that would be very helpful to work through with them on accelerating cleaner supply chain action, I think as Dimitri mentioned. So those are the remarks I wanted to give today, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Jason, and thank you to all the panelists for your very interesting comments and presentations. So now I'd like to open to the Q&A portion of our event, where the audience is invited to ask questions. So if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box at the base of your screen, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can in the time we have left. So just to kick us off here, Jason, you ended your presentation kind of laying out what are some of the ways that U.S. and China could work together, and just wondering if any of the other panelists, I know Stephanie, you mentioned some ideas as well, but yeah, wonder whether any of you would like to share kind of what you see as the greatest opportunity of something, that the U.S. and China could start with as something to work on. And also, any challenges you see in moving this collaboration forward. Anyone can hop in here.
I'm happy to jump in. So I think we've discussed legal, let's say, approaches quite a bit, but what I've seen in China recently is that, for example, greening the Belt and Road Initiative has made a lot of progress, not through legislation, but through very clear policy signals from the leadership, combined with guidance documents. And so because the state-owned sector is so important in China, that those signals are taken very seriously. And those guidance documents are actually quite effective at triggering a very quick change in behavior. And so I think just looking at the kind of the context in China being quite different from the US or Europe, we should recognize that this kind of dialogue, we should be very open to different types of approaches and things, different things may be very effective in China. And so, although we, Client Earth, focus very much on the law and this study I mentioned, we have in the back of our minds we keep very much the possibility that perhaps the fastest way to trigger the change would actually be through trying to get those higher level policy signals more clearly out there, and to see if it may be possible to develop such policy guidance documents in cooperation with the Chinese government.
I'd like to add just an example that I had on my notes, but I wanted to make sure I was at 8 minutes, that I think goes along with that. One of our largest members in the GCF task force is Mato Grosso, Brazil, which is one of the world's largest soy and cattle producers. And I think China is one of the main purchasers from that jurisdiction. And commodity companies in China worked with the Mato Grosso sellers to really try to figure out exactly that, like how do we clean this together? And I think there's some enabling conditions that may not be legal based, but are policy signals from the governments that can help on that. And this initiative in 2017 was from the China Soy Industries Association, establishing an MOU with the Brazilian Soy Farmers Association, really geared towards trying to green the soy trade between Mato Grosso and China. And I think there's other examples of this in practice, but increasing those, Dimitri, as you say, I think could be really a helpful way forward.
Yeah, Stephanie or Kirsten, do you want to hop in here?
I'll just add this sort of business to business or trade association to trade association on behalf of business. It has been one way that I've seen move forward between Vietnam and China on rubber, sort of the sale of responsible rubber to China, which is a major processor. So it sometimes might be a way that moves faster than government policy does.
I'll just add in the near term, we're looking at some of these major moments around the UN General Assembly, and as we approach the 1-year mark of the Glasgow Leaders commitment and the next climate summit, as moments to take stock globally on where we've come over the past year and what are the roadmaps and frameworks and implementation decisions that need to be made globally at this point. It's 2022. We need to start moving the needle 2025, 2030, 2050. So as I said, stay tuned.
Great. Thank you all so much for those great answers. So there I have a question here in the chat. How can policy best incentivize greening supply chains? That's something a few of you mentioned in your presentations.
Well, I'll just say quickly, just sort of referring back to two of these pending bills before the U.S. Congress, I think represent both kind of a carrot and a stick approach, where we can enact policy that both gives a strong demand signal that illegally sourced commodities or timber plant products cannot enter the U.S. market. In the case of the Forest Act and the Lacey Act amendments, is quite a strong policy incentive on the stick side. And then with the sort of the carrot approach of technical assistance, results-based payments, there is much that the U.S. government can do in this space, and more that can be done in concerted action with others in the private sector, public sector, to really move ahead, applying these sort of integrated approaches and carrot stick mechanisms.
Yeah, if it's okay, I might just add it. I think that's exactly the type of result that I think some of the subnational governments I work with are really looking for, to take that integrated approach across government. And every jurisdiction has very different drivers and very different realities on the ground. But I think I'm currently in Jalisco, and Jalisco is looking at greening their supply chain to try to attract investors who are interested in making sure they have a cleaner supply chain themselves. And that may be related to reputational risk from some of the investors, and maybe related to other reasons. For Jalisco, one of the things they're looking at is they're having challenges with water quality. So protecting forests is going to help with water quality. So it has these integrated effects if they are successful. But attracting the ability to have finance and investment that's recognizing those efforts really helps make sure that they're addressing the underlying condition that's causing the deforestation, which is economic realities, that it's more profitable to clear forest to plant agave for tequila or for cattle. So I think it's really kind of addressing both sides, from the producing jurisdiction and on the trade side from the demand side.
Yeah, that's interesting how there's kind of this intersection of these different drivers being pushes from the outside of wanting to attract business, but also internally of trying to keep water clean. So that's a great example. Jason, there's also a question in here asking if you're working with any provinces in China. Are you?
No, we're not currently. Our membership is really that map I showed, but I think we're really about information exchange and exchange of experiences. So we're very open to do that if any provinces are interested, and anyone on this call as well. So thanks.
Thanks. So Dimitri, you mentioned this project between China and the EU, and just wondering whether there have been any activities so far related to addressing deforestation, and also kind of how China's Ministry of Ecology and Environment kind of sees its role in this space.
Thank you. So I'll start with the role. I think that's actually a really important point. So China's National Forest and Grasslands Administration is kind of the regulator when everything that's related to timber. And so a lot of engagement in the past has been with the National Forest and Grasslands Administration, but there has been sort of limited progress in terms of this agenda. And of course, there has been progress. It's been somewhat limited. And I think that the greater the momentum right now is actually with the Ministry of Environment on the broader topic of deforestation commodities. And so that I would argue is currently a good a topic and it's sort of a good counterpart to engage with in China, because we see more momentum there right now, also in the context of COP15 for biodiversity. Sorry, I missed the first part of your question.
The first part of my question is just if there's been any activities yet as part of this
Yes.
EU collaboration on deforestation.
Yes, quite a few. So as Europe is mulling this deforestation, what's it called? The deforestation proposal in Europe, we've had a number of discussions, workshops with the Chinese government, with very broad participation from the Chinese government. So a whole number of ministries were represented in those discussions. And yeah, the attitudes towards the proposal varied quite significantly among them. We've also done something which I think is quite useful, is looking at what we call best practices of companies, also state-owned companies, so including foreign ones, but also Chinese ones. What we really wanted to do there was to say, hey, there is actually already quite a lot happening, and a bunch of companies are taking the initiative and doing very meaningful things. And so sort of to kind of inspire companies that may be considering doing something, but aren't quite sure where to start. So to give them examples of how this can be done, and the fact that others are already doing it, and especially within China, I think that's really helpful. And that's also where I think this might go next, is that it's possible that government in China will start to issue some guidance documents to state-owned companies to say what sort of behaviors they want to see. And then, to develop that kind of guidance documents, it's really helpful to see existing practices by Chinese companies, but also multinationals in terms of what they can do.
Yeah, that's great to hear. That things are actually going on. Okay, we have a question in the chat, which is, do you think it's possible to reduce deforestation without tackling corruption in producer countries? Anyone want to hop on that one?
I would just say plain no. It would be very, very difficult because you have to have good governance, and corruption is just undermines good governance. It's plain and simple. So, so many times we have worked in producer countries where there's not just corruption in the forest sector, there's corruption in the ministries of justice. And so you really are getting into issues where you have to address the problem across the board. Same thing with the minimal pay that forest authority staff are getting. If you're making $10 a week, how tempting is it when you get a $100 bribe? So these are the challenges that we're fighting against, and how it is so critical not just be working with ministries of finance, but also the ministries of the presidency, just the higher level interministerial institutions. And I would think that organizations like the International Monetary Fund, the World Banks, and others, they should be a partner in this if they're serious about addressing climate change.
Yeah, I can't echo enough the importance of working directly with government and across ministries, even at the subnational level, and making sure that you're working together both to build political will, but also transparency. So the approach that many of the governments in my organization take is really trying to increase engagement with communities, increase transparency. And it is not easy for anybody. It's not easy in producer countries. It's not easy in any country really, but making sure that that's moving in the direction of increased transparency and more holistic approaches is critical.
Great. Thank you both for those thoughts. We have another question here. So there's two big important international meetings coming up this fall. One is the climate COP, and the other is the Convention on Biodiversity COP. Obviously, we had a lot of great things come out of the COP last year. And so wondering whether any of you anticipate that these next two meetings will lead to accelerated action between the US and China.
I'm happy to, oh, you go ahead. WWF goes first.
I'll lead off and say that WWF expects to have a strong presence in both fora. The US is in an interesting space when it comes to the CBD because the US is not a signatory to it. And so the US government can and of course does engage with the process, but it is in a bit different way than formal signatories do. We're also entering into the start of a ramped up election season here in the US. The US elections will, I think, take place during the climate COP this year. And so, last year, I think, was quite a high watermark in terms of ambition. However, this year in the US with the recent IRA reconciliation language passed on climate, that is a significant achievement that the Biden administration can take in terms of, and that is a critically important step forward in terms of global forests and deforestation. I think we are looking at these moments and the next few months as a way, as I sort of alluded to earlier, to really take stock coming out of last year's high ambition commitments, which, frankly, were made after a number of voluntary commitments were not met for 2020 to end deforestation. So now we're looking at 2030. Now is really the time to ramp up the implementation and the funding and the actions and what is the that policy framework that can really drive change at the scale and pace globally that we need to see. So I think we will see some follow-up activities on the Glasgow Leaders Pledge, and we hope that those are robust and additive and well backed by finance and sort of the right set of actors from the government, private sector, human rights, civil society space.
So I'll go next. So we Client Earth will definitely be present at both of the COPs, and I will personally be at both. Especially for the biodiversity COP, I know it can be difficult for people to engage with the Chinese delegation. They are, they have a number of protocols that they need to observe, and also with the COVID restrictions, it makes it extra hard for them to go out and meet people. But I have a number of very close friends in the delegation, and I'll be sort of closely accompanying them. And if you're interested in having participation of Chinese officials or representatives in your, let's say, side meetings or other things, please do reach out. I might be able to help facilitate that. I also want to come back on Raphael's question about corruption in producer countries. It would be helpful if let's say, governance and rule of law was very strong in all these countries, but currently, in many countries it's not. And I think it's difficult to change that in the short term. So, and also, it becomes it's almost like regime change, or, it's really meddling in the governance of another country. So it's not very realistic. So a much more realistic approach, I think, is to just do what I think many of us have been doing, which is looking at the behavior of importers, large companies, etc., and holding them to account for their, let's say, supply chains, because if they're knowingly or if they would have good reason to suspect that perhaps their supply chains are troublesome, then that is illegal, I think, in many jurisdictions already. And so that gives us a much better hook to try to trigger a rapid change. And I think especially why do I have such high hopes for China here is because we're seeing very rapid improvement in a number of these issues. And if all the large buying countries and the large buying companies change, let's say, that the way they operate, then we have much less problems with sort of leakage and competitive troubles, and it would totally change, I think, the way the world works or the supply chains work. So that, in my mind, is a much faster way to get this change underway.
Yeah, there was another question from Marian about what individuals can do to help influence that. I think, Dimitri, your comment there really hits it. Individuals can work on who they're purchasing from and in trying to influence that importer side. I think the signal it sends, and we see this with some of our subnational members, is folks are looking at where they want to have more transparency and understand what impact they're having. So I think a lot of governments, of their own volition, but because of the signal maybe, are looking at how they can clean up their efforts or change their efforts. And I think our organization will have some of our member delegates at the climate convention, as well as some of us from our secretariat. And Dimitri may follow up with you, because I think many of them would love to be able to talk to potential partners in China and trying to apply these efforts across their state level governments of showing that they're reducing deforestation, maybe even increasing production while reducing deforestation is, I think, what folks are really looking to do, which helps address leakage. But we'll be there as well, trying to highlight some of those efforts and also the challenges. Stephanie, you mentioned there's a lot of commitments that have been made and not been met. That's the same within our membership as well. And part of that's because it's very, very hard to drive that economic signal in a different direction. So we'll be there as well, and look forward to seeing some of you.
Great. Can have a COP reunion. So as a final question here, just wondering, what you see, and that some of this was kind of hinted at as you guys are answering these questions before, but as the role of civil society in really supporting this kind of government to government collaboration to address illegal deforestation.
I'll just mention one quick example from within our government structure. In 2014, our organization the network has been around since 2008, and it was started by governors in California and elsewhere. And a lot of pressure was brought to bear within each jurisdiction and also globally to try to push these governments to work better with indigenous communities, local communities. And these governments have now worked very closely to try to develop kind of standards of operation at the subnational level, which is sort of new on indigenous rights issues. And it's hard, and the progress is slow, but there's a lot of efforts that community groups and indigenous peoples are bringing to really be equivalent folks sitting at the table with our state level governments. And I'm hopeful that continues, and it's been really interesting and fun and hard to watch. But that's one way that these community groups that we engage with are really helping push and lead the way.
Forest Trends is a nonprofit organization. I'd say that our niche is really providing transparency in data, trade data, market data, so you can actually see what impacts are and where hotspots are. I think there are many NGOs, Global Forest Watch, many others that are in this role of providing transparency to this issue.
Yeah, I think just to echo the other panelists, I think the role of civil society is quite essential to progress here, both in demand countries and producer countries, pushing businesses to make high quality commitments and keep them, transparency within the public sector, private sector space. It is really quite essential. And in particular, appreciate, Jason, your comments about the role of local civil society and Indigenous actors. That is really particularly essential, that these communities are, the conversation is centered around these actors. So the more that we can do to support that work and these conversations and that accountability function and that engagement function, the stronger we will be.
I'll just comment on that too. So the U.S. China relations are at a dreadful low right now, to the point that there are no formal bilateral discussions on any of these topics. And so that means that as civil society, we have an extra important role to continue to have this dialogue, because that's possible. And I think both sides do come to us to try to continue that discussion. So that's definitely an important thing that civil society can do. Another thing that I'd like to highlight is in the COP15 negotiations currently, sort of the what we call resource mobilization. So the finance part is probably the most important thing that needs to be advanced. And I've been in these formal negotiations, and it's really slow. So civil society, I think, can play an extremely important role there to sort of come up with ideas, come up with proposals, bring negotiators together in a more informal way, and to really advance this, because I see a real risk that we won't get a nice outcome in Montreal if we don't have some kind of a robust thing on resource mobilization. And currently, I haven't seen a whole lot of robust things yet. So that requires our efforts.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I just want to thank all of you so much for being with us, the panelists and our audience for joining us today. Really appreciate all the work that all of your organizations and all of you are doing, and really appreciate your time and participation in this discussion. This event has been recorded and will be available later on CCCI's website and also on our YouTube channel. So thank you so much, and hope you have a wonderful evening and wonderful day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.